That's balling. All right. I guess men lie, women lie. The numbers don't. It's over for that balling.
Men lie. Women lie. Numbers don't. Bud Crawford, when he fought in his last fight with Showtime, Sean Porter, according to reports, they only generated a total of 135,000 pay-per-view buys. 135,000 pay-per-view buys. Keep that in mind. They also average approximately under $2 million in live gates, which is the ticket sales. So we're going to rough it up. We're going to roughly say it's 2 million, just to have a whole number. So live gate, $2 million. Pay-per-view buys, 135,000 buys. Now let's do the math on that. Because ESPN Plus, they charge $69.99 per pay-per-view that's bought. Let's do basic arithmetic. $69.99 multiplied by $135,000 equals what? A grand total of $9,448,650. So let's put this in perspective. $9,448,650 was generated through the pay-per-view buys. And then $2 million was generated from what? Live gate. Stay with me now. That's only in the last fight, right? Okay, now let's include the fight before Sean Porter's that was on pay-per-view with Terence Bud Crawford. That was Amir Khan. According to reports, that fight between Terence Crawford and Amir Khan generated a total of 150,000 pay-per-view buys. So let's add both of those pay-per-view numbers up, because we're only going to review and evaluate just the last two pay-per-views of both fighters, starting with Bud Crawford. So 150,000 pay-per-view buys from Amir Khan fight, plus 135,000 pay-per-view buys with the Sean Porter fight. That's a grand total of 285,000 pay-per-view buys in Bud Crawford's last two pay-per-view fights. Now, let's talk about Errol Spence Jr.'s. Let's start with his last fight. In his last fight, he fought Ugas, right? I think that was in April. He fought Ugas. And he fought Ugas, and guess how many pay-per-view buys Errol Spence and Ugas generated? 375,000. Okay? 375,000 pay-per-view buys. Now, the same thing we did with Crawford, we got to do it with Spence. Let's go back to his previous pay-per-view fight with Danny Garcia, the one before Ugas. How many pay-per-view buys did that generate? A total of 250,000 pay-per-view buys. So we got to now then add both of those numbers together, right? And we will get a grand total. Stay with me now. of 625,000 pay-per-view buys. So let's go back to Bud Crawford's number. 285,000 total pay-per-view buys in his previous 2 pay-per-view headline fights. And then Errol Spence, 625,000 pay-per-view buys in his last 2 previous pay-per-view fights. Now, when we add those pay-per-view numbers up, okay, for Crawford, we get a grand total of $19,948,650. Let me say that again. $19,948,650. Now, when we add the 2 pay-per-view buys of Errol Spence, we get a grand total of $50,875,000. Let me say those numbers again. Bud Crawford generated a total revenue of $19,948,650. Errol Spence generated $50,875,000. Now, if you do the math and you subtract the $50,875,000 from the $19,948,650, guess what we come up with? We come up with the difference of $30,926,350 million. And if you break down the difference between the 625,000 pay-per-view buys that Errol Spence generated in those last 2 pay-per-view fights, and you subtract that from the $285,000 of pay-per-view revenue that Terence Bud Crawford generated in his last 2 previous fights, you will come up with the numbers of 340,000 pay-per-view buys as the difference. Houston, we have a problem. Now, I'm coming in the game representing fighter A, Errol Spence, whom I'm his manager. And I'm looking at the fact that between these 2 gladiators, these 2 fighters, these 2 world champions, we have 2 discrepancies. Discrepancy number 1 is that there is a $30,926,350 difference between the revenue of the last 2 pay-per-views. And the second problem we have is that there is a 340,000 pay-per-view buy difference between their last 2 pay-per-view buys. Now, the problem is not going to be my fighter. The reason why we have a problem is because fighter A and his representation, manager Marty, and the promoter, and the network, we all tied in together now. The manager, the promoter, and the network, all tied in to fighter A. All making an investment in fighter A. And we're all evaluating the numbers. And you mean to tell me we have a fighter B coming to us, telling us that he wants to see the books, telling us that he needs to see transparency, telling us that he wants 50-50, telling us that what we're offering him is less than the fair market value? What we're offering him is a slave contract? What we're offering him is a low ball? you ought to be grateful to get 35% of the pay-per-view streams if you fight my client. Because looking at these numbers right here, you're not qualified. You're not qualified. Because you're not a pay-per-view attraction. You're not. Let me point out something because somebody might question this. Let me point this out. You know that when Terence Crawford fights on ESPN Plus, they charge $69.99. I already mentioned that earlier. But I neglected to mention that when my client, Fighter A, let's say Errol Spence Jr., when he fights on Showtime and Fox Sports, they charge $74.99 per pay-per-view that's purchased. So already, there's a $5 discrepancy per pay-per-view that's being purchased. Okay? But that's not even the biggest discrepancy in this equation. The biggest discrepancy is the purchases. Fighter B, Terence Bud Crawford, you only have 285,000 pay-per-views that was purchased in your last two pay-per-view fights. My client, you already see what his numbers is. We don't have a problem showing you the books. You already see what his comparison to yours is. You see how many pay-per-view buys he's generating. 625,000 to your 285,000. Your 285,000 totals up to how much? $19,948,650. And my clients, with his last two pay-per-views, we're talking $50,875,000. We got a $30 million difference. Almost $31 million in revenue generated in pay-per-view buys alone. We're not even going to go at the live gate. Because my client, his live gate with Ugas was $5 million. Whew. I said $5 million. In the Ugas fight, his live gate was $5 million. Because they had over 37,000 tickets that were sold. Compared to Fighter B, Terence Crawford's last fight with Sean Porter, they only had what, 11,000 and some change? 11,000 people? What we talking about here? Be grateful for the 30 to 35% of the pay-per-view revenue share. And even 30% of the purse. Be grateful. You know why? Because Fighter B can't go anywhere else and generate the money that he's being offered. Now, I just asked y'all a question about 1.5 million. And it takes an American citizen that earns an annual salary of $50,000, 30 years to accumulate 1.5 million. So if Terence Bud Crawford is being offered, let's say 4 or 5 million, he ought to be grateful. That's a great deal. And if I was managing Bud Crawford, we'll take the 5 to 7 million purse without any hesitation. Because there's other streams of revenue that I'm going to make sure that my client is generating as long as I'm his manager. And we'll take the 30 to 40% split on a pay-per-view. Absolutely. That's fair. That's good business. Anything above that is a smack in the face to Fighter A. It's a smack in the face to his camp, his representation. It's a smack in the face to the network. And anything other than that is uncivilized. Men lie. Women lie. Numbers don't.